I've been doing the work, 5 words, and when you hear them, something inside of you tightens up or isn't right because you wanted to believe it and you wanted so badly for it to be true. But here's what your body already knew. The words changed, the behavior did not. So I'm going to show you something today that most therapists are not going to name directly. And that is how therapeutic language, the language of actually healing and of growth or self awareness, gets co opted and turned into a tool of control. And more importantly, I'm going to give you the behavioral markers that separate genuine therapeutic work from performance because it's learnable. And once you are able to see it, then you know what to look for. So, this pattern, it's every and it is increasing as therapy has become more mainstream, which is largely it's a good thing, right? The language of therapy has entered everyday conversations. We talk about boundaries, we talk about triggers, trauma responses, and nervous system regulation, and doing the work. But what I'm seeing in my clinical work is this language is being borrowed without the substance beneath it. So a person can learn to say things like, I'm setting a boundary, while using that phrase to punish another person for having a need. And a person can say, my therapist says, and then use a supposed clinical authority to shut down any conversation about their behavior. They can say things like, you triggered me in a way that makes their emotional reaction now it's become your responsibility because now you triggered them, which means that they can pretty much do whatever they want because they've got an open door now. That is not therapy. That is vocabulary of therapy completely emptied and refilled with something else entirely. And if you've been on the receiving end of this, if you felt a little crazy because someone was using all of the right words while the relationship kept getting worse and worse, I want you to hear me very clearly. You are not imagining it. I have watched it myself happen in real time between a couple in therapy, and I've had to correct it. So just know, take a deep breath and know this is actually happening. So I'm going to give you the clinical frame for what is actually going on. In genuine therapeutic growth, language and behavior, they move together as one boat going down a stream. A person will learn a concept and let's say what a boundary actually is. And then the behavior shifts to reflect the understanding, the gap between what they say and what they do starts to get smaller and smaller over time. That is what we call behavioral integration. The insight becomes embodied and it changes how the person is actually showing up. In therapeutic language, weaponized, something completely different happens. The person acquires vocabulary and often pretty quickly, but the behavior remains unchanged. Or worse, the new vocabulary becomes a more sophisticated delivery system for the exact same patterns. They're not doing the work. They're learning the script of someone doing the work. And those are really different things. A forensics perspective, this is actually a significant behavioral marker because the gap between stated insight and actual behavior tells us something really important about what's really operating. So when I'm evaluating someone, I'm not listening primarily to whether they can articulate growth. I'm watching for whether the articulation matches the behavioral evidence that I'm seeing. And that's exactly what I want you to be able to see. So let me walk you through the first major pattern, what I call vocabulary without accountability. And this is what it usually sounds like is I've been doing the work, but when you ask what the work involves, like what specifically they're learning, what behaviors they're trying to change, you get very vague responses. You'll get deflection or irritation that you're even asking because what I do in therapy is none of your business. I hear that response a lot between individuals and couples. My therapist says I need to focus on myself right now. And that becomes the reason nothing that you need can be addressed indefinitely. I'm learning to set boundaries, but somehow those boundaries only ever protect them from your needs. They never create space for mutual care. The behavioral marker there is consistency of application. Does the therapeutic concept get applied in all directions or does it only flow one way? Because genuine boundary work, for example, includes the ability to hear someone else's boundary without framing it as an attack. Genuine self focus includes the capacity to return to relational repair once the internal work has created more stability. So, when therapeutic language only ever serves the speaker, when it only justifies their behavior, only excuses their absence, and deflects from accountability, that is absolutely not insight. That is appropriation. And something that you can do to notice, start paying attention because your body often it's going to register this before your mind even has a chance. Your body is going to be on fire. And there is a really specific kind of exhaustion that comes from these conversations. You walk away, you're more confused than you were when they started. The words all sounded right, but somehow you're feeling worse. That exhaustion, that is data, that is information. And the second pattern is a little more insidious. I call it clinical authority co-optation. This is when someone invokes a therapist, a diagnosis, or clinical language to shut down conversations that they don't want to have. My therapist says, "You're codependent. You're projecting right now. That's your trauma response, not my behavior." Here's what makes this so disorienting is sometimes there's a grain of truth in that. And maybe you do have a trauma response that gets activated. Maybe there is a codependent pattern that you're working on. And the other person is using this, who's using the language, knows exactly how to find that little teeny tiny grain of truth and inflate it until it obscures everything else. And that is see that across the board in all kinds of relationships with high functioning individuals, people who are highly intelligent, who are verbally sophisticated, who learn systems really quickly. They learn the diagnostic system and then they use it. The behavioral marker here is directional diagnosis. Notice who's always being analyzed. Notice whose behavior is always being clinically explained. Notice who never seems to have a pattern that needs examination, right? In healthy relationships, even when both people have therapeutic awareness, there is mutuality in the reflection. I notice I'm doing this thing. What are you noticing about your side? Both people are willing to be seen in this pattern. The clinical lens only points one direction, outward at you, not together, where it's like both of us have something going on. Remember that because it's very important. It's when it's focused directly out, that's not therapeutic work. There's a couple other things that you could use to kind of see what is going on here, because it's possible that you've been so gaslit that you're just not even sure anymore right now. So this is really important. If you've ever tried to gently reflect something back, if you said something like, I notice when I bring this up, you whatever, you dot, dot, dot. Watch what happens. Does the observation get considered or does it immediately become evidence of your pathology? Maybe something like the fact that you're saying that shows how defensive you are. That response isn't therapy. That's the appropriation of clinical authority to maintain control. And I want to talk about what this does to your nervous system because the impact that it has is actually probably more significant than you realize. When someone uses therapeutic language against you, your system faces an impossible task. The words are signaling safety, insight, growth, all of the things associated with healing. But the rational experience is signaling danger, dismissal, and control. So your body is receiving contradictory information at the same time. And that's crazy making, not as a metaphor, as an actual neurobiological state. The result is often a kind of paralysis because you can't argue with the language because it sounds so reasonable, but you can't relax because your body knows something is very wrong. So you stay stuck, hyper vigilant, and exhausted at the same time. And it's important to understand that this response, it makes sense. It is not weakness. It is not codependency. It's what happens when your nervous system is trying to process contradictory data. And so your body is not confused about the behavior, your body is responding accurately to the relational reality. It's the language overlay that creates the confusion. So if you're in a relationship where you hear all of the right words, but you consistently feel worse, more confused, more exhausted, more unsure of your own perception, trust your body. The body is reading the behavior, not the vocabulary. All right. So this brings me to something I think is really, really essential for you to understand. When therapeutic language gets weaponized in an intimate relationship, it does not stay contained there. It corrupts your relationship with yourself. And if you've been following, I'm big on the 7 relationships and the whole framework because what happens between you and a partner, that is relationship 2, the intimate relationship. But it doesn't exist in isolation when someone consistently uses clinical language to define your reality, to tell you what your trauma is, what your patterns are, what your responses mean. it reaches into relationship one, and that is the relationship with yourself. You start to mistrust your own perceptions. You start to wonder if you are the one who is projecting. You start to feel like you need their interpretation to understand your own world. That is how abuse in one relationship type corrupts all of the others. The intimate partner dynamic becomes the lens through which you start to see yourself. And when that lens has been distorted, when someone has used the vocabulary of insight to obscure rather than to reveal, your self perception distorts with it. So, pattern recognition across all 7 relationship types is how we start to interrupt this. When you can see that the same dynamic language without behavior, vocabulary without accountability, shows up in how they relate to their family, their friendships, work, you start to see it is not all about you. It is a pattern, and patterns can be named. And once they're named, they lose some of their power because now we can actually see it. Now we can call it something. So, what does that make possible? First, and it's not small, it gives you permission to trust your own perception again. The gap that you've been sensing between the words and the behavior, that gap is real. You're not manufacturing any of it. You're not too sensitive or crazy or lazy or any of those things. You have been tracking a genuine incongruence, and that is not a flaw. That's actually intelligence. And second, it gives you a different way to evaluate what you're seeing. So instead of getting caught in the content of the therapeutic language, instead of defending yourself against clinical terms that are being thrown at you and used constantly, just step back and watch the pattern. Just watch what happens. Does the behavior match the language over time? Is the clinical lens mutual or directional? Does the insight translate into changed behavior or changed vocabulary? Those questions will cut right through any confusion. And third, it helps you rebuild your own relationship with therapeutic language, because something that I don't want to get lost is these concepts are real. Boundaries are real. Trauma responses and doing the work, that is very real. The fact that someone weaponized this vocabulary against you does not mean that the vocabulary itself is the problem. It means they were never using it in good faith. And you get to reclaim those concepts. You get to learn what acts when they're held with integrity, and you get to do the work, the real, actual work of understanding your own patterns and healing your own system. So, as much as they've tried, that is not taken from you, and that remains possible. So, if this gave you the language for something you've been experiencing, or if you recognize that gap between words and behavior that you've been sensing but couldn't name, you weren't exactly sure what was going on, maybe the only thing you had was weaponized, do me a favor, like, subscribe, share the video, do all the things, leave a comment, leave a heart, leave something, just so I know that you've been here and you've watched. All right. So I will see you in the next one.